Ladies and gentlemen, love is not a chemical illusion. It's not a trick of dopamine or a fleeting pattern of neural excitation. It's a structural reconfiguration of the human brain, a rewiring that alters perception, motivation, and even our concept of self. When we talk about love, we're not describing a simple emotion, we're describing a neurological transformation, a merging of memory, expectation, and biology into something that both transcends and defines us. In the world I live in, one built on logic, physics, and hard data, love often appears as an inconvenient anomaly. It doesn't fit equations. It doesn't yield predictable results. You can optimize a rocket's trajectory or the efficiency of an electric motor, but you cannot optimize the human heart. Yet, paradoxically, every great leap of innovation, every breathtaking act of courage, often begins with that same irrational force, love. I've spent much of my life surrounded by data, engineering, and relentless work. But I've also come to understand that behind every invention, there's an emotional engine. People think science is purely rational, but that's a myth. The motivation that drives a scientist to chase an answer that might take decades to find, that's not logic. That's devotion. That's love disguised as discipline. Now, imagine a mind wired for efficiency, optimization, and progress, and then imagine what happens when that mind encounters someone who doesn't fit within any system, any structure, or any predictable model. That's when chaos meets its reflection and finds itself changed. There was a time when I thought emotions were obstacles, when I believed that love could distract from purpose. The irony is that the very thing I feared most, emotional vulnerability, became the most instructive force in understanding the human condition. Love doesn't make us weaker, it reveals where our strength truly lies. Neuroscience tells us that when we fall in love, the brain activates the same regions involved in reward, focus, and goal-directed behavior. In other words, love literally programs the mind for obsession. But it's a sacred form of obsession, one that prioritizes another person's well-being as deeply as your own. It's why heartbreak feels like physical pain, because to the brain, it is physical pain. The neural pathways for emotional loss overlap with those for physical injury. You don't just lose a person, you lose a part of your neural architecture. And that's where the story gets personal. There was someone once, someone who changed the rhythm of my internal universe. For the first time, the equations didn't balance. Logic couldn't explain why her presence could calm storms that machines could not. I tried to categorize it, to reason with it, to compartmentalize it the way I've done with every problem before. But love doesn't respond to systems engineering. It defies calibration. I realized that when you try to hide love, when you try to contain it within secrecy or rationalization, it doesn't diminish, it intensifies. The human mind treats hidden emotion like a recursive loop. It keeps running deeper and deeper until it consumes processing power meant for everything else. In neuroscience, we call this perseveration, the mind's inability to shift away from an unresolved emotional state. You can bury it, but it keeps running in the background, like an unsaved file that refuses to close. And so, I did what many rational minds do when confronted with irrational feelings. I worked harder. I tried to drown the noise of emotion with the signal of productivity. Rockets, cars, solar grids, they became metaphors for control, for focus. But even in the midst of progress, something remained, a quiet, persistent hum beneath the surface. That's the fascinating thing about human biology. You can trick the brain into distraction, but you can't erase its emotional imprint. Every memory, every feeling leaves a trace, a network of synaptic weights that encode not just what happened, but how it felt. Love leaves its fingerprint in the limbic system, especially in the hippocampus, where emotional memory and spatial awareness intersect. So when you remember someone you've loved, your brain doesn't just recall them, it replays where you felt them. The place, the light, the sound of their voice, all stored as a holographic pattern of experience. You might hide a love from the world, but your neurons keep telling the truth. And perhaps that's why secrecy makes love even more powerful. When it's hidden, it becomes private gravity, pulling quietly, invisibly, but with immense force. The more you try to resist it, the more it shapes your orbit. You start building worlds around its absence, not realizing you're still revolving around it. For a time, I convinced myself that isolation was strength, that to achieve greatness, one must detach. That emotion was noise in the signal of innovation. But what I discovered was the opposite, that emotion is the source code of creativity. Every major breakthrough, from art to engineering, comes from the same neurological circuitry that fuels love. The dopaminergic systems that drive romantic attachment are the same that inspire invention. To fall in love is to enter a feedback loop of reward and risk, exactly like the process of discovery, yet love has its own logic. One that transcends even the most elegant mathematical proofs. It humbles the intellect, disarms the ego, and exposes the vulnerabilities we spend years hiding behind armor. And sometimes, that exposure can be terrifying, especially when your life is lived under a microscope. When every glance, every whisper, every human connection becomes speculation, dissection, distortion. So what happens when someone whose life is consumed by public scrutiny falls in love? They hide it. They protect it like a flame against the wind, because the world misunderstands softness in those who appear unbreakable. The paradox is painful to love deeply in a world that sees depth as weakness. And yet, hiding love doesn't protect it. It only isolates it, turns something infinite into something fragile. The more you hide it, the more it suffocates in silence. I remember once reading a study on mirror neurons, the cells that allow us to feel what others feel. When someone smiles at you, your mirror neurons fire as if you were smiling yourself. That's the essence of empathy, the neurological bridge between minds. Love amplifies this network. It makes you hypersensitive to another person's emotional state, even across distance. That's why you can sense someone's pain without words, why their absence feels like static in your nervous system. We think love fades, but scientifically it doesn't. The intensity may dim, but the circuits remain, the patterns endure. In fMRI scans, people who've been deeply in love still show activation in those same pathways decades later when shown images of the person they once loved. The chemistry changes, but the architecture stays. Love, in that sense, is immortal. And that realization frightened me, because it meant that even if you try to move forward, some part of you will always be anchored to that emotional signature. You can evolve, expand, build empires, reach planets, but your emotional gravity never fully releases you. The hidden connection remains coded in the very neurofibers that make you human. It's easy to talk about rockets, algorithms, or neural networks, but the real frontier, the one that defines our humanity, is emotional intelligence. It's the understanding of how love shapes cognition, decision-making, and creativity. It's the recognition that logic and emotion aren't enemies. They're two sides of the same quantum phenomenon, wave and particle, coexisting in one system. And I think that's what this hidden love taught me. That being human isn't about choosing between reason and feeling. It's about learning to synchronize them. When your mind and heart align, you create coherence, a neurological resonance that produces insight, compassion, and truth. Perhaps the greatest irony is that I spent years trying to control chaos, only to discover that love is the most beautiful form of it. You can't predict it, but you can learn from it. You can't contain it, but you can let it refine you. Love, in its rawest form, is data chaos, but it's meaningful chaos. It's the turbulence that forces the system to evolve. And if you look closely at every major leap in nature, you'll notice that chaos always precedes transformation. A star collapses before it shines brighter. A neuron destabilizes before it forms a stronger connection. A heart breaks before it learns what real connection means. When I look back, I see that hidden love as the catalyst for an entire reconfiguration of how I understood consciousness. You see, love changes the default mode network, the part of the brain responsible for self-reflection and inner narrative. In love, that network becomes quieter, less self-focused. The boundaries between self and other begin to blur. You stop thinking, me, and start thinking, woo-wee. That's not poetry, that's neuroimaging. The human brain literally redefines its sense of identity in the presence of emotional connection. And that's why losing it can feel like losing yourself, because in a way you are. The maps in your brain that once held us have to redraw themselves into me again, and that redrawing is painful. It's neurological reconstruction. But here's what few people understand: even that pain has purpose. Pain is information. It's the mind's way of teaching adaptation. When neurons break their old patterns, they do so to form new ones. So heartbreak isn't destruction, it's neuroplasticity in motion. The same process that allows a stroke patient to relearn movement allows a broken heart to relearn peace. I started studying that more closely, not in a lab, but in life. I watched how emotional pain can make someone more empathetic, more creative, more aware. How people who've loved deeply, even if they've lost, often become the most compassionate innovators, the most driven dreamers. They understand something about fragility that others overlook. They know that perfection doesn't exist. Only persistence does. And perhaps that's what love, especially hidden love, teaches us: persistence. The kind that endures through silence, through distance, through misunderstanding. Because even when unspoken, love is not wasted. Energy never disappears, it only changes form. That's physics, but it's also emotion. The affection you once poured into another person doesn't vanish. It becomes part of the world's invisible architecture. It fuels kindness in other places. It turns into art, into innovation, into acts of quiet generosity. At some point, I stopped asking why I had to hide it. Maybe it was never meant to be revealed in a conventional way. Maybe its purpose was to teach me how to feel again. Not just as an individual, but as a scientist, as a creator, as a human being. Because in that experience, I rediscovered something essential: empathy. Empathy is not softness. It's a form of intelligence, one that requires immense strength. It means you allow your neural circuits to simulate another's pain without losing your own stability. It's the most sophisticated emotional computation the human brain can perform. And love is the training ground for that skill. When you love someone you can't have, or can't show, your mind learns to operate in silence. It learns patience. It learns to derive fulfillment not from possession, but from understanding. That's when love becomes something higher than desire. It becomes reverence. And reverence is what keeps chaos from turning destructive. It's what transforms passion into purpose. In the scientific world, we talk about feedback loops, systems that self-correct through constant input and response. Love, too, is a feedback loop. When it's hidden, the external feedback disappears, so the system must self-regulate internally. That's how love becomes introspection. You start asking questions you've never asked before. What does connection mean without visibility? What does devotion mean without acknowledgement? Those are not easy questions, but they are deeply human ones. Over time, I began to see that love doesn't need to be public to be profound. Some of the most powerful forces in the universe are invisible. Gravity, magnetism, dark matter. They shape everything without ever announcing themselves. Perhaps hidden love operates in the same way, unseen, yet silently sculpting the trajectory of your life. And yet, every hidden truth eventually seeks expression. The human brain craves congruence, a state where what we feel, think, and express align. When they don't, the brain experiences cognitive dissonance, a form of internal stress that can manifest as insomnia, anxiety, even physical exhaustion. So when you suppress love, you're not protecting yourself. You're dividing yourself. You're creating two neural realities that can't coexist peacefully. I learned that the hard way. I learned that no amount of distraction can silence what's biologically encoded. The mind, no matter how advanced, cannot indefinitely suppress the truth of the heart. Eventually, the dissonance breaks through, sometimes as a whisper, sometimes as a storm. And in that storm, I understood something profound: to hide love is to hide from growth. Because love isn't meant to be contained, it's meant to expand consciousness. It's the universe's way of teaching connection, humility, and the impermanence of control. You can't innovate the human experience without first feeling it. Machines can simulate reasoning, but they can't simulate the ache of loss or the joy of reunion. They can't replicate the trembling uncertainty of caring for someone beyond logic. And that's why, despite all the technology, all the data, all the progress, love remains our final frontier. One day, during a conversation about artificial intelligence, someone asked me if I believed machines could ever truly understand humans. I said, not until they can fall in love and feel heartbreak. Not until they can be vulnerable. Because it's vulnerability that makes consciousness real. And love, especially the kind you must hide, is the purest test of vulnerability. It strips you bare. It shows you who you are when no one is watching. It forces you to confront the limits of your control. And in that confrontation, something miraculous happens. You evolve. You begin to see that love is not possession, it's expansion. It's not about merging into another person. It's about becoming more yourself because of them. The irony of hidden love is that, while the world may never know it existed, it changes you so deeply that it becomes visible in everything you do. Every word, every creation, every act of compassion carries its echo. And maybe that's enough. Maybe not every love story is meant to be seen. Some are meant to be felt, deeply, privately, endlessly, until they transform into something larger than romance, a quiet devotion to life itself. Science tells us that the human brain never truly forgets love. It simply reorganizes it. It converts the intensity into memory, the memory into meaning, and the meaning into wisdom. That's the ultimate alchemy, turning emotion into understanding. So when people ask me if love is worth the pain, I tell them this: everything that expands the mind is worth it. Everything that deepens your capacity to feel, to connect, to create, is worth it. Because in the end, the measure of a life well lived isn't how much you've built or achieved, but how deeply you've allowed yourself to feel. If I've learned anything, it's that the brain's greatest technology is the heart. All our progress, the rockets, the AI, the energy systems, they are extensions of the same impulse that drives us to love, the urge to connect, to reach beyond ourselves. Every invention, at its core, is a love letter to humanity, to possibility, to the unknown. And perhaps that's the truth behind the love I once tried to hide. It wasn't meant to stay hidden forever. It was meant to awaken something, to remind me, and maybe remind all of us, that no matter how advanced we become, no matter how far we reach, the greatest frontier remains the human soul. Because love, in its most honest form, is science. It's exploration. It's chaos refining itself into beauty. It's the force that keeps the universe expanding, and the reason we keep reaching for the stars. So if you've ever loved someone in silence, if you've ever carried a connection that no one else could see, know this: it still matters. It's still shaping you. It's still teaching you. And it might just be the most important experiment your soul will ever run. Because when the noise fades, when the lights go down, when all the achievements and failures dissolve into memory, the one thing that remains encoded in every cell is love. The kind you gave, the kind you received, the kind you couldn't show but could never forget. And maybe, in the end, that's all that ever truly keeps us human.